The war was over, but the hunt had just begun. While Nuremberg prepared to sentence the architects of the Holocaust, thousands of their comrades were already vanishing across Europe, not into hiding, but into salvation. Forged papers, priests with diplomatic seals, ships waiting in the shadows of Genoa's harbor, and at the center of it all, the Church. For years, rumors whispered that the Vatican itself had opened its doors to war criminals. But what if those whispers were true? What if faith became the final refuge of the damned? Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, do you believe morality should ever bend in the name of mercy? Now let's go back to the moment Berlin burned, and the first rat line was born. The salt-laden wind swept across the port of Buenos Aires on that gray morning of July 14, 1950, carrying with it the acrid smell of diesel and tar as the Italian cargo vessel Giovanna C. made fast to its moorings. Among the weary passengers descending the gangplank, clutching battered suitcases and displaced persons' documents, walked a thin man of unremarkable appearance. His shoulders hunched slightly forward, his eyes downcast behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He presented himself to Argentine immigration officials as Ricardo Clement, a technician fleeing the devastation of post-war Europe. The documents bore the unmistakable Red Cross of the International Committee of the Red Cross, validated by stamps from the Vatican's Refugee Assistance Office. What those documents concealed beneath their official seals was a truth that would take 11 years to uncover. This tired refugee was Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, the logistical mastermind behind the deportation of millions to the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. As he walked through customs without incident, past Argentine officials who barely glanced at his papers, Eichmann embodied a scandal that would eventually force the world to confront an uncomfortable reality: that thousands of Nazi war criminals had escaped justice not through luck or cunning alone, but through an organized network of escape routes that stretched from the ruins of the Third Reich to the monasteries of Rome, and ultimately to the welcoming ports of South America. The machinery of escape began assembling itself even before the final shots of World War II fell silent. In the chaotic spring of 1945, as Berlin burned under Soviet artillery and Hitler consumed cyanide in his underground bunker, SS officers across the crumbling Reich understood with crystalline clarity that their future held either execution or lengthy imprisonment. The Allies had already announced their intention to prosecute war crimes, and lists of wanted individuals grew longer each day. Tens of thousands of Nazi officials, SS officers, Gestapo agents, and fascist collaborators from occupied territories began a desperate migration southward, flowing like dark water toward the less controlled zones of Austria and Italy. By summer 1945, the displaced persons camps scattered across these regions housed more than 8 million refugees, a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale that provided perfect cover for those seeking to disappear. In camps like Glasenbach near Salzburg, and dozens of others dotting the American and British occupation zones, former Nazis shed their uniforms and identities, adopting the protective coloration of generic refugees. The chaos was total. With millions legitimately displaced by war, verification systems broke down completely. A former SS officer needed only to discard his uniform, claim to be from a bombed-out village in the east, and blend into the masses streaming through overwhelmed processing centers. Within this chaos, networks began to coalesce. Former SS officers who had escaped immediate capture made contact with each other through coded messages and prearranged meeting points established during the final months of the war. These networks, later documented by Allied intelligence under the umbrella term Odessa, the Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, represented the systematic effort by former Nazi officials to preserve both their lives and their looted wealth. Throughout the war years, Nazi occupation forces had engaged in systematic plunder on an industrial scale. Jewish property had been seized through the Aryanization program. Occupied territories had been stripped of art, gold, and cultural treasures, and forced labor had generated enormous profits for SS-controlled enterprises. As defeat loomed in 1944 and early 1945, high-ranking Nazis had transferred portions of these assets to neutral countries, particularly Argentina, Spain, and Switzerland. These funds, estimated by post-war investigators at hundreds of millions of dollars in contemporary value, now provided the financial infrastructure for escape. Former SS officers operating safe houses in Austria and southern Germany could provide fleeing comrades with false identity papers, civilian clothing, and cash, usually between $1,000 and $3,000 per person, enough to sustain a fugitive for months and pay for documents and passage to South America. The route these fugitives traveled would become known to Allied intelligence as the rat lines, a term borrowed from nautical terminology referring to the rope ladders sailors climb to reach a ship's rigging, but which took on a darker meaning in this context: the routes that rats took to flee a sinking ship. The primary rat line ran from Germany and Austria through the Alps into Italy, specifically to Rome and Genoa. The choice of Italy was strategic for multiple reasons. First, the Italian political situation remained unstable, with a weak provisional government struggling to establish authority after Mussolini's execution in April 1945. Second, Italy's long coastline and numerous ports provided multiple points of departure for ocean voyages to South America. Third, and most crucially, Rome housed the Vatican, an independent state with its own diplomatic apparatus, its own document-issuing authority, and its own network of churches, monasteries, and charitable organizations stretching across Europe and beyond. It was within the ancient walls of Vatican City that the most crucial element of the Nazi escape network took root, cultivated by Catholic clergy who viewed the defeated Germans not as war criminals, but as fellow Christians requiring salvation from communist persecution. The central figure in the Vatican's facilitation of Nazi escapes was Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian prelate who since 1923 had served as rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico di Santa Maria dell'Anima, the German national church in Rome. Hudal had long harbored sympathies for National Socialism, viewing it as a bulwark against Bolshevism. In 1937, he had published a controversial book titled The Foundations of National Socialism, which attempted to reconcile Nazi ideology with Catholic teaching, an effort that earned him criticism from many quarters, but also established his credentials among German nationalists. When the war ended, Hudal was 60 years old, with decades of connections throughout German-speaking Catholic communities and established relationships with Vatican officials. He immediately positioned himself as a champion of German refugees, arguing that Christian charity demanded assistance to all Germans regardless of their wartime activities. Beginning in 1945 and continuing until his quiet removal from office in 1952, Hudal transformed his position into what amounted to a clandestine travel agency for fleeing Nazis. His office in Rome processed documents for hundreds of fugitives, providing them with letters of recommendation to be presented to the International Red Cross, which could then issue travel documents without extensive verification. Among those he assisted were Franz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka extermination camp where approximately 900,000 Jews were murdered; Gustav Wagner, known as the Beast of Sobibor for his sadistic supervision of that death camp's operations; and Alois Brunner, one of Eichmann's chief deputies in organizing deportations across Europe. Working alongside Hudal was a Croatian priest who operated with even greater efficiency and scope. Father Krunoslav Draganović had arrived in Rome during the war as a representative of the Ustasha regime that ruled Croatia as a Nazi puppet state. The Ustasha had perpetrated genocidal violence against Serbs, Jews, and Roma, operating concentration camps like Jasenovac, where tens of thousands perished under conditions of medieval brutality. When Yugoslavia fell to communist partisans in 1945, Draganović understood that returning home meant certain execution. Instead, he established himself in Rome and began constructing what intelligence documents would later call the Croatian Rat Line. Draganovic's network utilized a chain of monasteries and churches stretching from Austria through Italy to the port of Genoa. His connections to the Croatian Catholic diaspora in South America, particularly Argentina, gave him access to documentation and contacts that proved invaluable. Working from an office in the Croatian religious institution of San Girolamo degli Lirici in Rome, Draganović processed paperwork for hundreds of Croatian war criminals, but he did not limit his services to his countrymen. Documents declassified in the 1990s revealed that he also assisted Germans, Hungarians, Slovaks, and others, apparently operating on a straightforward commercial basis. Fugitives with money could purchase his services regardless of nationality or the specific nature of their crimes. The mechanism through which these clerical networks transformed war criminals into legitimate travelers hinged on exploiting the International Committee of the Red Cross travel document system. In the immediate post-war chaos, the ICRC faced an impossible task. Millions of displaced persons needed documentation to resettle or repatriate. But normal governmental document issuing systems had collapsed across vast swathes of Europe. To address this crisis, the ICRC developed a streamlined process for issuing travel documents. An applicant needed to present proof of identity and 2 witnesses who could vouch for them. The system's vulnerability became apparent almost immediately. The proof of identity could be any paper document, no matter how informal, and the witnesses need not have extensive knowledge of the applicant. In practice, this meant that a fugitive Nazi could approach the Red Cross with a letter from a priest stating his identity, and the priest could serve as one or both witnesses. Given the ICRC's desperate need to process millions of cases and its limited resources, verification procedures were minimal. By 1946, Hudal and Draganovic had essentially established assembly line operations. A fugitive would arrive in Rome with money and a cover story. The priest would draft a letter confirming the false identity. The fugitive would apply to the Red Cross with this documentation, and within days or weeks, would receive a travel document that allowed legal passage to South America. The ICRC travel document was not a passport, but served the same essential function. It was internationally recognized proof of identity and right to travel. The final crucial element in the escape machinery was a willing destination country. Several South American nations accepted European refugees during this period, but one stood out for the deliberate, systematic nature of its welcome to former Nazis: Argentina, under President Juan Domingo Perón. Perón had come to power in 1946 after a military career that included a posting as military observer to Mussolini's Italy in the late 1930s, where he developed admiration for fascist methods of social organization and industrial development. As president, Perón articulated a vision of Argentina as a leader of a third position between American capitalism and Soviet communism, an independent great power that would industrialize rapidly and project influence across South America. This vision required technical expertise, scientific knowledge, and industrial specialists, precisely what unemployed German engineers, chemists, and technicians could provide. Moreover, Perón harbored ideological sympathies for European fascism and viewed the defeated Axis powers not as criminals, but as victims of Allied imperialism. In 1946, his government established special immigration programs explicitly designed to attract European technical specialists, with eligibility criteria that conveniently asked few questions about applicants' wartime activities. The Argentine immigration operation functioned with remarkable efficiency, coordinated through the country's embassy in Rome, and directed by individuals whose own Nazi connections were barely concealed. Carlos Fuldner, a German-Argentine businessman who had served in the SS and held Argentine citizenship, became one of Perón's key agents in Europe, traveling throughout the continent recruiting skilled Germans and facilitating their passage to Buenos Aires. Documents from Argentine archives opened in the 1990s revealed that between 1946 and 1952, the Perón government issued thousands of special landing permits and visas to Europeans, whose backgrounds would have disqualified them from entry to virtually any other country. The Argentine consulate in Rome worked in direct coordination with Hudal and Draganovic, creating a seamless pipeline. Fugitives who obtained Red Cross travel documents through the clerical networks would then apply for Argentine visas, which were granted with minimal investigation. Argentine diplomats accepted letters of recommendation from Catholic clergy as sufficient character references, despite these letters' obvious inadequacy for screening war criminals. The human cargo flowing through these channels represented some of the most notorious figures of the Nazi regime. Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat who organized the transportation logistics of genocide, reached Buenos Aires in 1950 after a journey that perfectly illustrated the Ratlines operation. He had hidden in Austria for 5 years, working as a lumberjack under a false name while his wife and children lived in Germany. In 1950, he made contact with the Escape Network, traveled to Rome, obtained Red Cross documentation through Franciscan monks connected to Hoodel's Circle, received an Argentine visa, and sailed from Genoa under the name Ricardo Clement. He would live in Argentina for a decade, initially working menial jobs before eventually finding employment at a Mercedes-Benz factory in Buenos Aires, where he worked on the assembly line, living in modest circumstances but entirely free from prosecution. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor whose sadistic medical experiments tortured thousands, including children subjected to chemical injections and surgical mutilation without anesthesia, followed a similar route in 1949, settling initially in Buenos Aires before moving to more remote locations as investigations intensified. Mengele had hidden in Germany immediately after the war, protected by his family's agricultural machinery business, but FBI documents declassified in 2017 revealed that American intelligence had located him in Argentina as early as 1947, yet no extradition was pursued. The list of Nazi criminals who found refuge in Argentina reads like an indictment of the post-war international order. Erich Priebke, an SS captain who participated in the Ardeatine massacre in Rome, where 335 Italian civilians were executed in reprisal for a partisan attack, settled in the mountain resort town of Bariloche in Patagonia, where he lived openly under his own name for 5 decades, running a delicatessen and becoming a prominent member of the local German community. Walter Rauff, the SS colonel who invented the mobile gas vans that murdered approximately 100,000 people across occupied territories, reached Chile in 1949 with Vatican-provided documentation and worked for Chilean intelligence during the Pinochet era. Eduard Rochman, known as the Butcher of Riga for his supervision of the Latvian ghetto where tens of thousands of Jews were murdered, escaped to Argentina in 1948 and lived there until 1977, when his identity was exposed and he fled to Paraguay, dying before he could be extradited. Gerhard Bohne, who administered the T4 euthanasia program responsible for murdering approximately 70 Oroi-Rowan disabled Germans in psychiatric hospitals, reached Argentina in 1949 and practiced medicine in Buenos Aires suburbs under a false name. Heribert Heim, the Mauthausen concentration camp doctor who earned the nickname Dr. Death for lethal experiments that included injecting toxins directly into prisoners' hearts to time their deaths, escaped to Egypt via the Rat Line in 1962, living in Cairo until his death in 1992. Estimates of the total number of Nazi war criminals who escaped to South America vary considerably based on how one defines the category. If limited to those directly implicated in mass murder or major war crimes, the figure ranges from 5 to 10 individuals. If expanded to include all former SS members, Gestapo agents, and collaborators from occupied territories, the number climbs to perhaps 15 or more across all South American countries. Argentina received the largest share, but significant populations also settled in Paraguay, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. The Paraguayan dictator Alfredo Stroessner, himself of German descent, welcomed ex-Nazis who often served in his security forces. Brazil's German immigrant communities in the south provided cover for fugitives. Chile, under various right-wing governments, proved hospitable. Each of these countries had motivations: anti-communism, desire for technical expertise, corruption, or simple indifference, that overcame whatever moral qualms might have existed about harboring mass murderers. The Vatican's role in facilitating these escapes remains one of the most controversial aspects of post-war history. Pope Pius V, who occupied the throne of St. Peter from 1939 to 1958, maintained an ambiguous position throughout the war and its aftermath. During the Holocaust, he refrained from publicly condemning Nazi atrocities by name, instead offering only generic denunciations of violence against innocents. Defenders argue he feared that explicit condemnation would provoke Nazi retaliation against Catholics in occupied territories and might endanger the Vatican's neutrality. Critics contend his silence reflected institutional anti-Semitism and excessive concern for the Church's political position. After the war, Pius XIII's priority became preventing communist expansion in Europe, a goal that created an environment where priests assisting former Nazis could portray their work as saving Christians from Soviet persecution. Documents from the Vatican secret archives, partially open to researchers in 2020, reveal that Vatican officials were aware of Hudal's activities by at least 1947. Reports from the Vatican's Refugee Assistance Organization noted his work with Germans whose backgrounds were questionable. Yet he continued operating until 1952, when he was quietly removed from his position as rector, not because of his assistance to war criminals, but because newspaper articles exposing his activities threatened to embarrass the Holy See. The institutional question remains: did the Vatican as an organization facilitate Nazi escapes, or did individual priests act independently? The evidence suggests a middle ground more disturbing than either extreme. The Vatican did not issue official policy directing clergy to assist Nazis, nor did senior officials directly organize the rat lines. However, they created and maintained conditions that enabled such assistance. Vatican diplomatic papers could facilitate international travel. Vatican charitable organizations provided cover for document procurement. Vatican bureaucracy's opacity prevented outside scrutiny. Individual bishops and priests who assisted Nazis operated within Vatican structures, used Vatican resources, and exploited Vatican prestige, all without facing sanction until public exposure made inaction untenable. This pattern suggests willful institutional blindness at best, tacit encouragement at worst. No priest involved in the rat lines was ever excommunicated or prosecuted. Hudal retired to a quiet monastery and died in 1963 without ever expressing remorse. Draganović returned to Yugoslavia in 1967 under mysterious circumstances, dying there in 1983. The Vatican has never issued a comprehensive accounting of its clergy's involvement in facilitating Nazi escapes, maintaining that post-war refugee assistance was motivated by Christian charity without political considerations, a position historians find increasingly difficult to sustain as archival evidence accumulates. The exposure of Nazi fugitives living freely in South America occurred gradually across decades, each revelation shocking international consciousness and raising questions about how justice could have failed so comprehensively. The first major break came in May 1960, when Israeli intelligence agents kidnapped Adolf Eichmann from a Buenos Aires suburb and smuggled him to Israel to stand trial. The operation, executed by the Mossad, involved months of surveillance to confirm that Ricardo Clement was indeed Eichmann, then a swift nighttime abduction during which agents grabbed him as he walked from a bus stop to his modest home. The Argentine government protested this violation of sovereignty, but international attention focused on Eichmann's trial, which began in April 1961 in Jerusalem. For the first time, Holocaust survivors testified in detail about the deportation machinery Eichmann had operated, and the world witnessed the bureaucratic face of genocide, a middle-aged man in a glass booth, speaking in clipped administrative language about transport schedules and killing quotas. Eichmann's defense that he had merely followed orders convinced no one. He was convicted and hanged on May 31, 1962, the only person ever executed by the State of Israel. The Eichmann case transformed the hunt for Nazi criminals. Previously confined to official channels and limited budgets, the pursuit now engaged private organizations, investigative journalists, and activist groups who refused to accept that mass murderers should die peacefully in retirement. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, founded in 1977 by Holocaust survivor Simon Wiesenthal, made tracking Nazi fugitives its central mission, publishing annual lists of most wanted suspects and providing investigative support to prosecutors worldwide. Journalists uncovered fugitives through persistent research. Erich Priebke was discovered in 1994 by ABC News reporter Sam Donaldson during a 50-year anniversary story about the Ardeatine massacre. Priebke, then 81 years old, admitted his identity on camera, apparently believing himself protected by time and distance. He was extradited to Italy, where legal proceedings stretched across years due to his age and Italy's complex judicial system. Ultimately confined to house arrest, he died in 2013 at age 100, having expressed no remorse and maintained that the massacre was a legitimate military reprisal. Josef Mengelé's fate illustrated both the persistence and limitations of the hunt. After Eichmann's capture, Mengele fled Argentina for Paraguay, then to Brazil, where he lived under false identities while moving between several families of German expatriates who sheltered him despite knowing who he was. The Mossad attempted to locate him, but lacked resources for sustained operations in South America after the Eichmann mission. West German authorities issued arrest warrants but had no extradition treaties with most South American countries. In 1979, Mengele suffered a stroke while swimming at a beach in Brazil and drowned. His grave, under a false name, was discovered in 1985 after one of his protectors informed German authorities of his death. Forensic examination confirmed the remains were Mengele's, meaning the angel of death had escaped earthly justice entirely, dying at age 67 without ever facing trial for the tortures he inflicted on thousands at Auschwitz. The revelations about Nazi fugitives in South America eventually forced a broader reckoning with how the post-war order had failed. In 1992, the discovery of the Archives of Terror in Paraguay, secret police files from the Stroessner dictatorship, revealed extensive documentation of Nazi criminals living in South America and their connections to later right-wing military regimes during the Cold War era. These documents showed that the initial network of Nazi fugitives had evolved into an informal transnational alliance linking anti-communist military governments, intelligence services, and organized crime throughout South America. Former SS officers had trained police and military forces in Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay. Some had participated in Operation Condor, the 1970s coordination between South American dictatorships to hunt down left-wing dissidents across borders. The rat lines that began as escape routes had metastasized into ongoing criminal enterprises. Argentina itself began confronting this history only in the 1990s, after the return to democracy following the military dictatorship's collapse in 1983. In 1997, President Carlos Menem established CIANA, the Commission for the Clarification of Nazi Activities in Argentina, which spent 2 years investigating the Perón-era's relationship with Nazi fugitives. The Commission's 1999 report confirmed that between 180 and 300 major war criminals had found refuge in Argentina with the knowledge and assistance of the Perón government. It detailed the roles of Fultner and other agents, the coordination with the Vatican networks, and the deliberate policy of accepting former Nazis as desirable immigrants. The report stopped short of assigning individual criminal responsibility, and no Argentine official faced prosecution for facilitating war criminals' entry. Nevertheless, it represented an official acknowledgement of what had long been known unofficially, that Argentina had served as a sanctuary for perpetrators of the Holocaust. The legal and moral implications of the Nazi escapes to South America reshaped international law and human rights jurisprudence. The 1968 United Nations Convention on the Non-Applicability of Statutory Limitations to War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity, which entered into force in 1970, established that genocide and crimes against humanity could be prosecuted regardless of how much time had passed since their commission. This convention was a direct response to the realization that Nazi criminals were aging and dying beyond the reach of justice. It enabled prosecution of former Nazis discovered in the 1980s and 1990s, though the advanced age of defendants made trials problematic. Defense attorneys argued that elderly, infirm clients could not receive fair trials, while prosecutors maintained that victims had not been granted the luxury of growing old. Countries including Germany, Poland, France, and Italy conducted trials of Nazi criminals well into the 2000s, some involving men in their 80s and 90s facing charges for murders committed 60 years earlier. The Cold War context explains, though does not excuse, much of why Nazi escape networks operated so freely. By 1947, the wartime alliance between Western democracies and the Soviet Union had fractured into confrontation. American and British intelligence services, focused on containing communist expansion, made pragmatic calculations that proved morally catastrophic. Some Nazi intelligence officers were recruited by Western intelligence because of their knowledge of Soviet operations. The Gehlen organization, composed of former Wehrmacht intelligence officers, was essentially taken over intact by the CIA to spy on the Soviet Union. If intelligence operatives could be employed, the logic went, lower-level war criminals might be ignored if they kept quiet and stayed out of trouble. This calculus valued anti-communism over justice, with consequences that reverberated for decades. When former Nazis in South America were exposed, Cold War alliances often protected them. Military governments that cooperated with Washington in anti-communist operations were unlikely to extradite fugitives if doing so would expose their own complicity. The role of the Red Cross in facilitating Nazi escapes, while less culpable than the Vatican's, nonetheless represented an institutional failure. The ICRC's mission is humanitarian neutrality, providing assistance to all people in need regardless of political considerations. After World War II, facing the largest refugee crisis in history, the organization prioritized speed and breadth of assistance over careful vetting. This was perhaps understandable given the scale of need. Millions were displaced, starving, and desperate. Yet the ICRC's procedures proved catastrophically inadequate to prevent abuse. A system requiring only 2 witnesses and accepting letters from clergy as identity verification was almost designed to be exploited. Internal reviews conducted decades later acknowledged these failures, but at the time, the organization defended its procedures as appropriate for emergency conditions. The ICRC never prosecuted or punished staff who issued documents to Nazis, maintaining that individual employees had acted in good faith based on documentation presented to them. This institutional defensiveness prevented meaningful accountability and allowed former Nazis to cite Red Cross documents as proof of legitimate refugee status. 8 decades after the collapse of the Third Reich, the history of the rat lines continues generating controversy and investigation. Declassified intelligence documents regularly reveal new details about who escaped, who helped them, and who knew about it. The Vatican's decision in 2020 to open portions of the Pius Themed archives to researchers has generated renewed scrutiny, though significant sections remain classified, and the Church maintains privacy restrictions that frustrate historians seeking complete documentation. Holocaust survivors and their descendants continue seeking accountability through courts, museums, and educational initiatives designed to ensure these failures are not forgotten or minimized. Organizations like the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany pursue financial restitution from German companies that employed concentration camp labor or benefited from Aryanized Jewish property, ensuring that economic complicity faces consequences even when individuals escape justice. The rat line's most disturbing lesson may be institutional. Systems designed to protect and assist can be corrupted to shield and enable. The Catholic Church's refugee assistance infrastructure, established for genuine humanitarian purposes, became a mechanism for laundering war criminals' identities. The Red Cross's emergency documentation system, created to help displaced persons rebuild their lives, provided legal cover for mass murderers. Argentina's immigration apparatus, ostensibly accepting skilled European labor, functioned as a reception committee for genocidaires. Each institution maintained plausible deniability, individual actions by rogue elements, emergency conditions that prevented proper verification, humanitarian obligations that superseded political considerations. Yet the cumulative effect was systematic impunity for thousands of individuals who bore direct responsibility for industrialized murder. The question that haunts this history is not whether mistakes were made, they obviously were, but whether at some level these were not mistakes at all, but rather choices reflecting values, priorities, and calculations that placed anti-communism, institutional self-interest, and ethnic solidarity above justice for genocide's victims. When Ricardo Clement walked off that ship in Buenos Aires in 1950, he carried with him not just false papers, but the collaborative failure of institutions that professed the highest ideals. The Vatican claimed to represent Christian mercy, but showed selective compassion that excluded Holocaust victims while embracing their murderers. The Red Cross proclaimed humanitarian neutrality, but implemented procedures that treated war criminals and refugees identically. Argentina presented itself as a modern, civilized nation, but constructed an infrastructure specifically designed to welcome men who had operated gas chambers and orchestrated death marches. The Allied powers declared commitment to justice, but allowed Cold War considerations to override prosecution of genocide. Each institution had its reasons, its rationalizations, its bureaucratic logic. None of these reasons withstand moral scrutiny. The smoke from the ship's stacks that carried fleeing Nazis to South America dissipated long ago, but the questions their escapes raise remain suspended over history, demanding answers that institutions have never fully provided and perhaps never will.